All right, everybody, welcome to this episode. I could not be more excited to have on a friend and colleague of mine. He is an associate professor of pediatric emergency medicine at WashU in St. Louis. Is also associate program director there for the fellowship. And Dr. Fahd Ahmad, our guest for the show today, is a man of many talents. He's a blogger, has a website called Rogue Dad MD. We're going to talk about that. A podcaster, author, researcher. He wears a ton of hats, which is actually why I wanted to bring him on the show, because Fahd and I share a lot of similar passions, most notably family, faith, and finances. In fact, on the personal finance front, Fahd and I wrote a paper together with a prior resident of mine, Jake Matthews at Wake, on financial literacy and residents and fellows, and about student loans specifically. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome the man, the myth, and the legend, Dr. Fahd Ahmad, to the show.
Well, thank you, Dr. Turner. It is wonderful to be here, but I'm waiting for the applause line. You're building me up so much, and there's no live studio audience to really reflect how amazing I am. I'm somewhat disappointed.
They're actually applauding in their cars as they listen to this on the way to
Oh,
work right now. You just can't hear it. It's around the world. It's going to reverberate.
okay. So I'll probably raise your iTunes podcast ratings significantly, just by having me on here because
Yeah,
they're going to be very enthusiastic for me.
I should pay you actually for that.
Wait, hold on. I'm not being
Wait,
paid
no.
for this?
Oh, I just said that recording. No, you're not. All right. So moving on. Fahd,
Yes, Jimmy.
you've got a ton of interests, man. So, and we share a lot of them. So the name of the show is probably going to be Family, Faith, and Finances with Dr. Fahd Ahmad. Although I like Rogue Dad MD because that has that certain kind of.
Use my fake name. I don't like my real
Oh,
name.
yeah. Rogue Dad MD is amazing. So speaking of which,
Yeah.
on Rogue Dad, you've got this title. It says that you take an alt brown look at medicine, money, faith, and family. And then you've got this awesome Twitter account that, like, I just don't even know how to start. Like, it's got a picture of George Clooney, and it says basically you're pretending to be a peds ER doc, and that you're a Muslim dad with 3 boys, rambling about medicine, money, faith, and family. And so, you just have a lot of stuff going on. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background, your story, how you got started on Rogue Dad MD, and just, all of it. Where do we go from here?
Man, so where to start? So first, I get a lot of crap sometimes about using George Clooney as my avatar photo on Twitter. And for those who don't know, George Clooney got his start on the television show ER playing a peds ER doctor. And
There you
so
go.
that is why when I first made this account, I chose to use his photo because also when I started that name and that website and Twitter account, I also was entirely anonymous. I did this. I essentially made this as a personal outlet just for creativity, expressive, personal things are important to me, which is what the tagline is talking about medicine, money, faith, family, and I started writing blog posts about those things, made a social media account mostly to sort of broadcast those things and connect with people. And this was 2016, I want to say, and it was just a way to get things out there because I have a lot that always goes on in my head, and I often don't have anyone to say this stuff to.
I feel you.
And so it was a way to put stuff out into the void, not necessarily expecting anyone to care or listen or respond, but and not necessarily implying that it's of quality or worth doing those things. But sometimes you just want to say stuff and get it out of your head just because you think, oh, this is an interesting thought, or this is a funny joke, or I'm curious what people think. And it was just a way to start connecting with people outside of sort of traditional social media at the time, which is mostly things like Facebook, which honestly I think was already toxic back then, and I've rarely use Facebook now. I just can't stand it, honestly.
Yeah.
And so I spend more time, which is still not a lot nowadays. I spend less than I used to in terms of social media interaction, more on my semi-anonymous Twitter account than I do on Facebook or probably actually texting my friends and family, which maybe that's not a good thing, but that's a separate
Yeah.
issue.
Maybe a separate conversation. Well, but
Yeah.
it's interesting because I still remember when your Twitter handle just blew up because, like, it wasn't your kid with like the tooth fairy and like doing some science experiment or something.
Yes. So my blog, my social media account, it was all not very well known until I made this really offhand tweet one night when I found out that my then 9-year-old basically tricked his mom and I into proving that there was no tooth fairy. He's a very smart, precocious kid who's actually about to turn 13 very soon. And essentially he was curious about things like the tooth fairy or Santa Claus, and he had a tooth come out, and it was, and I've gotten grief over this. We didn't notice the tooth came out because it was the back of his mouth, right? And he's 9 years old. We're not checking his mouth every day. I don't watch him brush his teeth. So a tooth came out. He didn't tell us. He hid it under his pillow for a couple days, waited. We had no idea. And then he told us, oh, hey, this tooth just came out. I'm going to put it under my pillow for the tooth fairy. And the next morning, and I snuck into his room that night, put money under his pillow, and it turns out he was like, "Aha!" He didn't have a video camera or anything set up, but he confronted his mom with his hypothesis and his evidence, and she basically just gave up the ghost and was like, "Yeah, you're right. That's us." And so I
That's
just
when
wrote
you,
an offhanded tweet about it, just not thinking about it, and it blew up. And then I just sort of jumped into the comments, started going back and forth. A local news reporter here heard about it, wrote an opinion editorial piece about it, and then international news. I think it got written up in some UK outlets even, and even now it's been 3.5 years, almost 4 years, I
yeah,
think, since I this
yeah.
tweet. And every so often, I still have people reach out to me or comment on it personally or online, and it got seen across multiple platforms by 50, 60 million people. It was something insane.
Yeah, that is pretty crazy. I've only ever had the experience of going viral for all the wrong reasons, and so I think
We
it's
we may not want to talk about that on this podcast if this is going publicly.
yeah, we're gonna leave
Keep
that
this
one.
PG.
Yeah, we'll keep it PG. But I just thought it was so hilarious that your your 9-year-old hid the tooth for a few days to like see if it would happen, like get paid if he didn't tell anybody, and then ended up confronting you about it later on. I thought it was pretty great.
Yeah, he's a fantastic kid, and he's got a bright future ahead of him, and not in science probably. He actually wants to be a comic book artist, but
Ooh,
he
I
has
love
a
it.
very very scientific mind.
Well, hey, so speaking of family, the
Yeah.
first time that I ever saw you speak publicly, I obviously knew about, Rogue Dad MD, and I think we'd, exchanged correspondence a time or two before that. But you came and spoke in Las Vegas at the White Coat Investor Conference, and you were speaking on your divorce in part during that talk. And as someone who is very intentional about being transparent with people, because I think it's important to destigmatize certain things, I found that so refreshing that you were bold enough to have that conversation on stage in front of a lot of people. But I'm just kind of curious, why did you choose to talk about your divorce? And what kind of message do you have for people out there that may be going through something similar, or on the rocks, or what have you?
So that's a great question. And when I went to give that talk and when I proposed that talk for the conference, it was actually not divorce wasn't part of the picture at the point when I actually proposed the talk. The talk was actually focused on personal experiences related to secondary trauma or second victim syndrome, and really, which sort of for those of you who are not familiar with the term, but maybe in healthcare and know the experience, it's really just essentially PTSD from things you've gone through at work as a healthcare provider. And I had a very, very difficult personal time after a case of a young child I took care of that died a few years ago in our emergency department, and stuck with me a very long time. And I was having an extremely difficult time processing it, and it was really haunting me for a long time, and wasn't talking to anyone about it. And when they were putting out the call for speakers for the conference, and I was still working to try and sort of struggle my way out of this, and I just, those of you who don't know me may already get the sense and realize I just kind of like to talk, and I was looking for a way to sort of express the emotions around it, to sort of for a catharsis, because I had actually tried seeing if I could put pen to paper and write about this for my blog, write an editorial, and I couldn't get words out on paper. It was just
Mm,
writer's block, and so I decided I should speak about it, and it wasn't easy. And it was in the time between when that paper or when that talk got accepted for the conference and when I actually presented, is when our divorce proceedings started. And the divorce itself wasn't originally planned to be part of the talk. It wasn't happening at the time that I proposed the talk. And I still tried to make 98% of the talk about the secondary trauma issues itself, and not make this a talk about divorce, because that's not why I came and not what I was trying to share. And I actually was still trying to work my way through the secondary trauma stuff, even at that time, months later.
mm,
But going through the divorce at that time, preparing for it with the lead up to this being right before COVID hit, it certainly became part of my personal journey. And there was no way to completely separate those out.
sure.
And the challenges I was going through trying to recover from that secondary trauma, which I thought was probably the hardest thing I dealt with emotionally and professionally up to that point, was really once I was going through divorce, it sort of paled in comparison. And I said that on stage, but I tried to make the talk sort of focus back on the original topic, but it was very cathartic just to talk about it, because one of the things I learned going through secondary trauma and then going through divorce is that, at least for me, and I think this is true for a lot of people, though they don't want to admit it, is, there's really no style points for suffering in silence, right? I mean, you
Mm.
don't get as far as you know, you don't get bonus points from God or your boss or anyone else from just suffering in silence, and that may be a culture that a lot of people come from, and I certainly have had lots of cultural backdrops where this kind of stuff isn't talked about in terms of personal hardship. And certainly divorce is not something that I came from a background that was part of at all. I'm the first person in my family to go through divorce. It wasn't something I wanted to talk about. It was kind of shameful, frankly, that even though it was the right thing for our family to separate in that regards, it's not something I could wanted to be open about, but I felt like I had to be. But interestingly that you mentioned it, I actually just gave a talk 2 weeks ago at the White Coat and Gester conference about divorce specifically. And after I gave that talk 2 years ago on secondary trauma and mentioned the divorce in sort of in passing, but it was actually the first time I'd ever publicly told anyone about it. I'd only told friends and family up to that point. I'd never mentioned anything online. I thought, I need to come back and talk about divorce, because
Mm.
hopefully 2 years from now, maybe I'll be better off. And I've done a lot of processing, a lot of examination of myself and those around me, and I think I'm doing pretty well, all things considered. And when I went on the stage a couple of years ago, that was really meant as my catharsis to sort of work through it. When I went on the stage a couple of weeks ago to talk about divorce, it was really just a way to share experiences. Because even though divorce was much more challenging in so many ways, infinitely more ways, frankly, than the secondary trauma was in so many ways, I'd also done a lot more processing. I'd learned a lot more about sort of how to handle these things. And it doesn't mean it was easy, it was far from easy. But at least I actually could speak from some experience of now sort of having been through the worst of it, and hoping that they might resonate with other people, that
Yeah.
maybe
And,
they
and
could get something from it.
I just want to, highlight something that you're saying. Um, so, Brene Brown is, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with Brene Brown's work, but she's a researcher in shame. And one of the things that she says is that, shame really kind of grows in environments where we don't talk about it. And in fact, one of the ways of dealing with shame is to give voice to that experience and to talk with, in particular, trusted confidants and people that you really are able to lay yourself out in front of, and that when you do that, that's one of the best ways to combat shame. And so I think that it's interesting because her research, which is what she does for a living, echoes exactly what your experience was in talking about it. And I think that that's true, whether it comes from shame from something that happened professionally or from a personal event or situation. But I just think it's really, really important to highlight that, because I think that there are a lot of people that struggle with shame for various reasons. And what they do is suffer in silence, like you're saying.
Yeah, and I know there's plenty of people out there who probably wouldn't ever do this, and that's okay. You don't have to speak publicly about things. What I've tried to encourage people to do is, you don't have to go into a public platform to voice the things that are bothering you. There's lots of outlets, whether that's friends or family or counseling or therapy or whatever it may be. Seek an outlet that works for you. Get into new outlets if none of the ones you have work for you. It wasn't a plan of mine 3 years ago to speak publicly on such traumatizing topics. It wasn't, but that's sort of how I decided I needed to go through life, and that matches my personality better than a lot of other outlets. But there's lots of other ways to express yourself without going on a stage. That I still question at times whether that was the best decision. But then in retrospect, I was like, yeah, that really was for me the best thing to do. And I also, when I do public speaking, I even on serious topics like those, I want it to be fun and entertaining, because the topics themselves are serious and deflating. And if you're going to share it, just making everything about the downside is, who's going to want to listen to that, right? I don't want to make that kind of talk. No one's going to listen to that kind of talk. I
Right.
want it to be something that's still enjoyable, even when you're talking about some of the worst things that you go through.
Yeah, no, I think that's what's really fun about listening to you speak publicly is exactly that, because you do have a little bit of a side gig in being a comedian, that you're well known for. And if you don't believe me, you can follow his Twitter account, because that's usually a good source for that stuff. So, all right, got divorced, and you have 3 kids,
Yep.
right? So you're a family man, and that is a huge passion of yours. I've got 3 kids, and so a big passion of mine too. But something else we actually share in common is personal finance, and you and I wrote a paper on this, right, on student loans and people's financial literacy. And I thought it was pretty interesting that, you know, I mean, it wasn't surprising, but it was interesting that basically the residents and fellows didn't know anything about money, particularly when it came to student loans. Even when we put it in true false formats, people would get it wrong whether public service loan forgiveness was tax free or not. And so the state of financial literacy is what it is. But you have, also performed your own studies in personal finance at WashU, looking at, the investing front. And, that's what we base the second study off of. So you have this big interest in money. I'm kind of curious to learn more about where that came from and how financial freedom, money, plays a part in, your career and life as a physician.
You know, the interest in doing research around it sort of stemmed from being a good academic doctor. So, my interest in terms of managing money, having an interest in personal finance, I would say actually comes from childhood. And I'm fortunate to have a father who was well educated, is a physician. And, while he never shared a ton of his personal experiences, when my older brother and I were young, like, elementary, middle school age, he actually wanted us to learn some of the basics of investing because of some negative experiences he had had as an adult, and started teaching us the basics of investing, including, the difference between a load and no load mutual fund and things like that, and tried to have us, understand and research in mutual funds on Charles Schwab at the time, and gave us small amounts of money to try and invest. And, at the age of like 8, 9, 10 years old, you only care so much about this kind of stuff, right? So it's not a lot of fun when your dad's quizzing you in the car, what's a no load fund versus a load fund, or did you check when's the last time you checked your portfolio? It's like, I don't know, Dad. I'm watching cartoons. Leave me alone,
Yeah.
right?
I just want to go play basketball.
But the interest and the relevance for it stuck with me, even though certainly I went long periods where I didn't think much about it, or I had no money to invest, so it didn't really matter. I was just sort of going through my life. But coming out of residency into medical school, then medical school into it, really out of training, and actually having an income again. And also, that's when I got married, and having to do collaboration around finances. I really wanted to be I wanted to really be on top of finances and feel like I knew what was happening with the money that we earned, and be able to start planning for the future. And it was very nebulous back then. I think I'm much more concrete the last 3 4 years than I ever was, back then, as a resident or fellow, in terms of what my goals were. But I wanted to not feel out of control when it came to finances. And I was still, again, fortunate that I wasn't saddled with $300,000 in loans like a lot of graduates now are. I was much better off, and I'm very fortunate for that. And that certainly, to a degree, colors where I came from and where I am now. But it's been an interest of mine to sort of have that understanding and not have to go to a financial advisor, to not worry that I'm making the wrong money decision, to say that, hey, if things go sideways with a family member or a spouse or a job, that I can focus on those kind of things, and not where's the next paycheck going to come from to
Mhm.
feed someone, right? And so I wanted that kind of financial security and awareness, so that way I could manage those things. And one of the things I learned is that it really doesn't take as much effort as most people think to be financially knowledgeable for the basics, right? I mean, that's one of the core things I learned a long time ago. Is And one of the things a lot of doctors get scared into not managing their finances, and it's why there's so many financial advisory firms that specialize in doctors, because they manage to scare a lot of doctors into thinking that they're not able to manage their finances, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? It's
Mm.
just ridiculous.
Yep.
There's a whole industry on basically conning doctors out of their money to saying you're too busy and this is too important for you, when that's just a bunch of BS. So years ago, I started giving personal finance talks at my institution, initially just to my fellowship group and then our residency program. And that turned into me doing the study that you mentioned several years ago, where as I was prepping to give the first talk on finance to teach some of them, I said, I'm a good academic doctor. I was already doing research at the time. Let me see if I can survey our trainees to figure out what they know and don't know, just so I can understand what to teach about. And this ended up becoming a survey trying to reach all of the trainees across my entire institution, and then bringing in a second institution, doing and getting responses across two unrelated universities, and turning this into a big financial knowledge survey. And the short answer is, this was 5 years ago. I think the average score on our 20-question quiz on financial literacy was something like 52%. So I think it's better now. I'm sure it's better now. We've talked about whether we should repeat it just to see overall whether it's gone up. But
Sure.
I've been giving these talks now year over year. Started a curriculum for our medicine and peds residents. I give talks externally now to other programs, and I have sometimes more requests for talks than I can possibly do. I have to turn them down, but I really want people to feel empowered that they can run their own lives. And obviously, there's very extremes. You can go to overboard on this, and you can go the other extreme and put your head in the sand. But I still hate when I hear how many people are just sort of worried and too scared to even take control over the basics. That I want them to know that you can just like in medicine, you can pick one thing and learn that really well, and then go on to the next one. You don't have to hand everything over to someone else because you're too worried about climbing the mountain, right? It's still one step in front of the other, just like becoming a doctor.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I always break people up into three groups of doctors, right? So you got the do-it-yourself investors, which are you and me, and then you got the dot the i's, cross the t's that hopefully, I mean, they know enough about money. They could probably do it themselves, but they want a professional to make sure they're not doing anything really stupid with their money. And then you got the third group, which is like the overwhelming majority of doctors, which is like the outsource group who send like, to the money girl or the money guy that's, handling their money. And they trust it, without knowing anything about it, that the person's doing what's best for them, which it turns out oftentimes is not the case.
Yeah.
As you're alluding to. And so, yeah, with financial literacy, campaigns, like I think it's really important, the students you're teaching there, the students that I'm teaching at Wake, to at least get people into that second group of dot the i's, cross the t's, where like if you're getting a financial advisor, you at least know kind of how to
Yep.
find which ones are good versus the ones that
Yep.
are out to put you in loaded funds and sell you whole life insurance. And
So
so
I have a question for you, Jimmy. How long
yeah,
have you been teaching at Wake for personal finance?
this is the third year
Okay.
now for the
So at what
official
point? So when we did
curriculum.
the survey of your trainees, how far into doing the education were you? Like, had you started doing the teaching at that point?
Yeah, so I think that it had been up for like maybe a year, like it was in that first iteration. And I'd given
Okay.
personal finance talks in terms of being asked to come and talk for orthopedics and
Sure.
pediatrics and so on and so forth throughout the institution. But in terms of a formal curriculum, that's been 3 years. And so yeah, that actually may have been right around the same amount of time that we did that survey. It
I'm
actually
just I'm,
the survey may predate it.
okay, because I'm
Now
just
that I
trying
think
to I'm
about it.
just trying I'm just trying to figure out, is the low score a reflection of the lack of education or a reflection of them needing better education?
Mm. So so no, it's a good question. So the personal finance curriculum that I teach is for fourth year med students, and the people we
Oh,
surveyed were
okay.
residents and fellows. So I get to escape on that one. Although I
Okay.
did offer the program to the GME office, and yeah, that has not been put in place for reasons that will remain off this podcast. But all that to say, they didn't want to support it. So that was something that was a huge passion of mine back then, and has been a passion of yours. And so it's interesting though, because I think that there is a movement towards getting some inertia in that space. So it would be interesting to kind of look at it and see how things have changed. But what about you personally? You got these two camps, right? Like you got the old school traditional like fire movement, where we're just going to save a bunch of low cost diversified index funds to get to financial independence. And then you got the other group, which is a little bit newer and trying to cash flow through typically real estate or some other non-clinical source of income. So when you think about your own personal journey in personal finance and what you've learned, which kind of camp do you prescribe to, or do you mix to both the hybrid method? Where are you at?
I have traditionally, from an investment portfolio standpoint, been in the, I think, more traditional, I guess nowadays to call it the index fund ETF, really hands off, not have to worry about it, not think about it. And part of that's a function of just trying to hit basic saving goals and money available, right? There's certainly going back 10 years, if I had double the income, I sure I would have been doing things well beyond that because I would have had extra money to spend and invest and to think about those things. And I didn't. And so, I really didn't feel like I needed to dabble in real estate because I didn't have the money to dabble in real estate. It really was sort of an irrelevant discussion for me personally. And that's one of those things where people ask me about real estate and I say, well, I've not had a reason to learn a lot about it because I didn't have the money to worry a lot about it. And so while I know a lot of the basics because I've read about it, I don't actually have a lot of the experiential learning.
Mhm.
But that's again one of those things with finance where you don't have to know all that right at once, right? It's one of those things you can learn incrementally as you go. And I'm just now for the first time recently, I would say going back and revisiting those things and saying, okay, I think maybe I'm at a point in the next, I don't know if this several months or a year or two, whenever it would be, where I can do stuff like other types of income generation. And certainly the Rogue Dead MD site and things like that, there was brief points earlier where I was trying to make that income generating, but I since I started that really as a creative outlet, it was never really focused as a business the way the White Coat Investor site was, where he had clear focused goals on income and revenue, and if he didn't hit these goals, he wasn't going to do it. The
Mhm.
reason my site's still up is not because I'm making a lot of content and making a lot of money. is because I want to be able to make jokes on Twitter, and every so often I might get someone to go read some old blog post I wrote, and I'm
You're
thinking that
you're, you're
maybe over.
really you're really raking it in. You're just not telling us.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm totally ready to walk away from my day job or my night job, as it were, as an ER doctor any moment. Yes, this is definitely my 2 weeks notice right here on this podcast. You're hearing it first here,
You
Jimmy.
heard it first. That's right.
Yeah, no, hey, no, seriously, department chair, I need my job, please. I'll be there next time. Don't worry, I'm coming to my shift.
All right.
But I'm just recently, certainly going through the divorce has changed a lot of perspective on things, both just generally on life approach, but also financially. And I think right now I'm fortunate my finances are fine because things were doing okay before the divorce. And while certainly there's been a time of adjustment to what the finances look like, I'm financially fine. But I'm just now starting to look again, I would say, towards are there options outside of just my regular work? Not that I'm trying to go part time or anything, because I'm not, but in terms of the time I used to spend towards blogging or whatever else that other people might be running marathons, which I don't want to run a marathon or do an Ironman or a triathlon. Maybe I can put towards things that are more in my niche, whether it's public speaking or things that you and I have talked about separately offline, like life coaching, things like that,
Yeah.
which I wouldn't have thought about a few years ago. But the experiences I've had the last few years give me a lot of new insights and experiences and things that I think give me opportunities, but also thoughts I hadn't had before about where this may or might go in the future.
Yeah, no, and I think it's good to keep doors open, and like you said, I think so many things like medicine are experiential in nature, and that you learn a step in it at a time. And money is certainly that way. So if it seems overwhelming, taking that first step and just getting your feet wet, wherever you might be able to pick up on that personal finance knowledge is huge. So, well, all right, Fahd. So let's think about the show. We've talked about divorce. We've talked about money, which are two taboo topics, right? So
That's what I'm best at.
I figured we'd round it out here. So you and I both come from different traditions of faith, right? So I'm Christian, you're Muslim, right? And we are chatting on this podcast about life and physician life and your life as a doctor, as a dad. And I remember reading um, actually a post on Ramadan back, I guess it was a couple years ago. It's been some time, and kind of how that impacted your life as a physician and also as a family man in terms of what you do and don't have. And so, I really thought it'd be cool to hear your perspective on how your faith shapes, your life as a dad and a doctor.
That is such a big question. I don't even know how to give a short, simplified answer. And anyone who's made it this far in the podcast has already picked up on the fact that I just kind of ramble till I realize I should stop talking. So
I like the stories; they're good.
I'm gonna see if I can give a succinct answer to this. So, my parents are Muslim. They moved here from Pakistan. I was born in the States and born and raised Muslim, still practicing Muslim, though certainly there's always room to be better in certain aspects of the religion or modify certain practices. And I have plenty of folks who know me who could probably tell you some of that. But at the same time, I still consider myself a practicing Muslim. And my children, even though post divorce, are still going through a Muslim education. And you can't really separate it out because part of being Muslim, and this may be similar to the way your faith is practiced, is it's just inherent in your identity. It's
Mhm.
first and foremost, right? That's you're raised to consider yourself a Muslim before anything else, and that's part of being the Muslim. That's part of being a Muslim. Part of the Ummah, the collective of Muslims around the world, is that shared faith and understanding, regardless of whether you're in America or Pakistan or anywhere else. It just becomes a part of who you are,
Mhm.
and it's meant to sort of shape how you view day to day things. It's meant to shape how you view your interactions with others, parents, education, all those things, right? And certainly there's a huge amount of variation because there's cultural aspects of the religion that are not necessarily part of the formal teaching of the religion that become very implicit in it. So my family, coming from Pakistan, sometimes has different interpretations of that than a family that maybe only have been from the U.S. or been from
Mhm.
other predominantly Muslim countries or non-Muslim countries, right? That influence what you consider taboo or not, that sort of creep into the religious view, but maybe more of a cultural view. And so I can't really separate them out because it's just sort of part of who I am, and it colors it in the way my parents taught me, the way my parents were raised. It's not where this and this. It's just this is all mixed together. And I growing up here, sort of, I don't know, I always use the wrong term because some people would call me first gen, having been born here. Some people would call me second gen. I grew up. I grew up with a handful of really close Muslim friends, but in an area that didn't have many Muslims. I grew up as Pakistani American in an area where I was surrounded mostly by Caucasian folks, right?
Mhm.
And even now, still living in the Midwest, the vast majority of people I interact with are Caucasian, and my ex-spouse is Caucasian, right? And so my I have a lot of interactions where it's very clear sometimes that I don't fit in, not because I stand out, but because other people come from a perspective that's so different where even though I may joke the same and I may go to the same restaurants, that in the background, my perspective on things is actually quite different, and the way I was raised to view things is quite different, and the cultural religious worldview I take to things is quite different. And sometimes it doesn't come out till a really intense discussion on something comes up, because day to day, I'm just like anyone else. I'm living my life, right? I'm getting my work done. I'm going to the hospital for my ER shifts. I'm trying to get my kids to school and to baseball practice, and getting the kids to stop trying to injure each other, because I got three boys, and fights and crying and bleeding is a routine part of our process. But it's still building it. Okay, it's time to pray. Oh no, we're not going to eat that because we're Muslim, or we're not going to do that because of something this, right? And so you try and weave it in day to day and not make it internally as something that stands out. But I live in an environment where it's pretty easy because my skin color is darker, right?
Mhm.
And because my name is kind of funny sounding compared to the average American, that I sort of let it fade into the background because I'm so used to it. But for a lot of other people, if they don't know me, that's what they see. And the ones who do get to know me probably forget about it because I don't talk about it constantly, but it's definitely there all the time. So that's a long-winded answer to say I don't
No,
really know how to answer your
no, I
question.
really like it. I really like it because I remember, and I can't remember which post it was on, but you had one post that, and it might have been your post on why you use the phrase alt brown on your site. And 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 I think this is so true because it is so easy to have an opinion about people who may look or believe or differently than you, that are diverse from you, and in terms of where you came from and your culture and your background. And then you become friends with somebody that comes from a tradition or a background or certain place of origin that is different than yours, and you've had these opinions that people have told you your entire life about that kind of person, and you meet them and you're like, wow, you're just kind of an awesome human, and I
Wait,
find
wait.
it's
Are you calling me an awesome
no, I
human?
mean everyone else that I was talking about, not you. You're
Damn it,
terrible.
Jimmy.
But no, so I'm serious though. Oh yeah, you're awesome, by the way. But I think that's so true, and particularly in this very divisive environment that we live in politically, I think it's so important that people befriend other people that come from different backgrounds, and that diversity and inclusion is so huge nowadays. And when you do that, and it's one of the first questions I actually ask people when we have those really difficult, controversial conversations with friends of mine in person, and they have a really strong opinion about a certain group of people. And I'll ask them, like, when's the last time you broke bread with somebody that we're talking about right now? And they'll be like, I mean, oftentimes the answer is never.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet they have such strong opinions about them. And I'm like, I bet you that if you met this person, had a conversation with them, made eye contact with them, shook hands with them, ate a meal with them, that your opinion about that would be so different than it is. And so I think your answer is perfect. And just, just it's woven into every aspect of who you are. And my faith is, as you mentioned, very similar. So,
Awesome.
well, Fudd, I'm kind of curious as we round out this show. We've talked on a lot of different topics, but if you could provide the audience that's listening today with, one piece of advice, or just something that you've learned on your journey, maybe about the things we've talked about, or outside of that, what would that be?
I would say, regarding the stuff that we've talked about and what I've gone through the last few years, and what I think a lot of people have gone through, even on different topics, living through 2 years of a pandemic. As we're recording this, there's, it feels like World War III is starting as Russia invades Ukraine.
Mm,
People are stressed about all sorts of things. And COVID, it seems like for the first time, provided what almost feels like an excuse to talk about not feeling great about our lives or ourselves or challenges that we have and stresses that we have. And it's interesting, even in healthcare, it took a pandemic and some of the worst experiences healthcare providers have ever gone through to say it's okay to feel burned out or to need help. And
mm.
that need was always there, right? The need for help was always there. It's just we finally have this really weird excuse of a pandemic to say it out loud, that, oh, life sort of sucks sometimes. and we always sort of needed that. It's just we had this culture built up, not just in medicine, but I think across a large swaths of the things we do in large parts of the country and probably the world, where suffering in silence and sucking it up was sort of the standard, and saying you needed help or asking for help is looked down on. And I would say, if there's one piece of advice I could give is, if you need help, who cares if other people who cares what other people's opinion are? If you need help and you recognize it, it's okay to seek help in whatever form you need that help in. And this can be personal, professional, family, religious, money, whatever it is, right? Again, I don't think there's bonus points for suffering in silence. I don't think there's any points for suffering in silence, right? I'm not a religious scholar. Maybe there actually are bonus points religiously. I guess I can't even answer that. Maybe I'm overstating my ability here. Maybe you really do, like Job. If you go through the plague and you just sit there and suck it up, right? Maybe that actually is good.
You get brownie points.
Yeah, but I don't personally view that as like the most likely way to get favor, whether it was with God or country or whoever else, is just to sit there and suffer and be miserable. So if you need support, get support. Tell people you need support, even if you don't know what the support is. That's okay. Just finding someone you trust to say, "Hey, I think I need some help," and go from there. And I think putting voice to those things by itself, even if you don't know what to do next, can make you feel so much better and help you open up doors and figure out what the next steps are. And sometimes you find out once you just say it out loud, then you can get past that big thing in your head. And now the answers start rushing in, and the logic and the clarity or emotion or whatever it is, you start getting control over. And we can only control so many aspects of our life, right? There's very limited things we truly have control over. And I don't really even know how to voice this properly, but we do have control over what we're willing to share, what we're willing to voice. And we can't always control our emotions. Some people might think you and I were just discussing offline, some people talking about how we should be able to control all of our emotions, and I think that's BS. I think there's lots of things that stimulate our emotions that we have to work backwards through very intently to control. We don't always have that immediate rational control over the things we say or do, even though we wish we did. But the one thing you can do is recognize where you are. And I think if we're going to put effort in anything, recognize where you are and where you want to go, and see at least what the first step is to closing that gap. And even if it looks like the rest of that journey is huge, who cares? Just forget about the rest. Take that one step and move forward.
Yeah. Oh man, I love that. And it just brings me the imagery. Like we in medicine have this idea, like being the good soldier, right? Sucking it up, and suffering in silence is strong, and that asking for help is weak. We actually say that in medicine, right? Like if you ask for help, it's weak. And it's exactly the opposite. Like most people, like, have you ever had anybody come to you in life, be like, "Hey, Fahd, I've got this problem, and I need your help, and I'm going to tell you about this situation that's going on." And then they lay out their life in front of you and ask for help. And you're like, you know what? You are a weak human being. Like nobody ever does it. You're like, wow, like the amount of
that's
courage and
basically
bravery.
my parenting style. So, my kids are going to be tough as nails and emotionally traumatized.
Secondary PTSD. We've
Yes.
gone full circle. Well, hey, Fahd, such a pleasure having you on the show, man. And can't wait to have you back in the future. Thanks for tagging along and playing nice.
Yeah, and can I add one last final comment?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, go Cardinals. Braves suck.
Oh no, the Braves are great. We cut the recording off right before this. All right, man. Take care.
Thanks. You too, Jimmy.